Walter Hayes was 67 years old, the morning everything he thought he knew about one rainy night in November fell apart. He was standing at his kitchen sink in Dayton, Ohio, rinsing out the same coffee mug he had used for 11 years, when he heard 3 sharp knocks at his front door. Walter wasn't expecting anyone. Nobody knocked on his door anymore. Not since Carol passed. Not since his daughter stopped calling. When he opened it, a woman in a gray suit stood on his porch holding a leather briefcase, and she asked him a question that made his hands go cold. "Mr. Hayes, are you the man who let Daniel Mercer sleep on your couch on the night of November 3rd? Walter stared at her. He had never heard that name in his life. And what she said next would change everything he had left. She told him Daniel Mercer was dead, that he had died 11 days ago, and that before he died, this man Walter couldn't even remember by name had done something no one saw coming, something that would drag Walter's quiet life into courtrooms, newspaper headlines, and accusations that would turn his own neighbors against him. Because the stranger who slept on Walter's couch for one single night was not who he claimed to be. He was worth $340 million. And 9 days after leaving Walter's living room, he sat down with his lawyers and rewrote his entire will. What Walter didn't know yet, what he couldn't have known, was that the lawyer standing on his porch wasn't there for the reason you think, and neither was the stranger. This is a story about one act of kindness and the price of it. To understand what happened on Walter's porch that morning, you have to go back 4 weeks to a storm that rolled through Dayton on the night of November 3rd. But before we get there, you need to know what kind of man answers a knock from a stranger at 9 o'clock on a stormy night. Walter Hayes had spent 41 years working the same machine shop floor, the kind of job that leaves your hands scarred and your back bent, and he had buried the only woman he ever loved 2 years earlier. His house was quiet now, too quiet. His daughter Tricia hadn't spoken to him since the funeral, since the fight neither of them could take back. Walter had exactly $940 in his savings account. He had no idea he was about to be tested. And here is what makes this story so hard to look away from. The man who knocked on Walter's door that night had already knocked on dozens of doors before his. Doors in towns just like Dayton. Doors belonging to people just like Walter. Most of them never opened. Some opened and closed just as fast. A few opened only when money changed hands. Daniel Mercer was running out of time, and he was searching for something, going house to house in the rain like a man possessed. And the note he left folded on Walter's couch the next morning contained 5 words that wouldn't make sense for weeks. You were the last one. The last one for what? Why Walter's street? Why Walter's door? And why would a dying millionaire spend his final weeks on Earth sleeping on strangers' couches? Those are the questions this story answers. But I'll warn you now, the answers are not what you expect. Because when Daniel Mercer's brother found out what was in that rewritten will, he didn't grieve. He hired the most expensive litigation team in Ohio and pointed them at a 67-year-old retired machinist with $900 to his name. He accused Walter of manipulating a dying man. He called that night of kindness a con. And then his lawyers produced a photograph that Walter could not explain, a photograph that suggested the stranger's visit was never random at all. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Dayton, Ohio sits in the southwest corner of the state, a city built on manufacturing, on men and women who clocked in before sunrise and came home with grease under their fingernails. Walter Hayes was one of them. He started at Brennan Machine and Tool in 1979. 20 years old, fresh off his father's farm, and he stayed for 41 years. The men on that floor knew him as the guy who never called in sick, who covered your shift when your kid had a fever, who kept a coffee can on his workbench where anyone short on cash before payday could borrow a few bucks. No questions, no ledger. He met Carol at a church picnic in 1981. She was serving lemonade. He came back for 4 refills before he worked up the nerve to say a full sentence to her. They were married within the year. Walter and Carol never had much, but they had a rhythm. A 3-bedroom house on Kettering Avenue bought in 1984, a mortgage they paid off the year Walter turned 55, and one daughter, Tricia, born in 1987, who came into the world screaming and never really stopped fighting for what she wanted. Carol worked the front desk at a dentist's office for 30 years. Every evening she left the porch light on before dinner, whether they were expecting anyone or not. Walter asked her about it once, early in their marriage, and she told him something he never forgot. She said her own mother did it during the Depression, so anyone lost in the dark would know which house would open its door. Carol had one rule, and she repeated it so often it became scripture in that house. You never turn away someone standing in the rain. The trouble started in 2019 when Carol found the lump. Stage 3, then Stage 4, then 18 months of hospital corridors and treatments that emptied their retirement account faster than the disease emptied her strength. Walter sold his truck. He sold his father's old rifles. He picked up night shifts at 63 years old to cover what the insurance wouldn't. None of it was enough, and in March of 2021, Carol died in a hospice bed with Walter holding her hand and Tricia stuck in traffic on Interstate 75, 40 minutes too late. That was the wound that never closed. At the funeral, grief turned into blame. Blame turned into shouting in the church parking lot. And Tricia said words to her father that she couldn't take back. Walter said some of his own. She drove back to Columbus that night. They hadn't spoken since. So by November of 2024, Walter Hayes was a man living inside a museum of his own life. Carol's coat still hung by the door. Her handwriting was still on the calendar in the kitchen, frozen in a month from 3 years ago. He fed a stray orange cat that showed up on Tuesdays. He went to coffee hour at First Methodist after Sunday service, mostly to hear human voices. And every single evening, without fail, he turned on the porch light, because Carol always had, and turning it off felt like admitting she was really gone. His savings were down to $940. His pension covered the bills and not much else. He was not a man waiting for a miracle. He was a man waiting for nothing at all. And then came the storm. The night of November 3rd brought one of the worst late autumn storms Dayton had seen in a decade. Rain came down in sheets. Wind pulled branches off the oaks on Kettering Avenue. And by 8 o'clock, the power was flickering up and down the street. Walter was in his armchair with a can of soup warming on the stove when he heard it. A knock. Slow, heavy, almost apologetic. He looked at the clock. 3 minutes past 9. Nobody knocked on Walter's door at 9 at night. For a moment he sat still, listening to the rain hammer the gutters, and then the knock came again. Walter got up, turned on the hallway light, and opened the door. Standing on his porch, under that light Carol always insisted on, was a man in his early 60s, soaked through to the skin, shivering, with no car in sight. The man apologized before he said anything else. He said his name was Dan. He said he'd been walking, that he had nowhere to be tonight, and that he'd seen the porch light from the end of the street. He asked if he could stand under the awning until the worst of it passed. Walter looked at him for a long moment. The man's shoes were good shoes, oddly good for someone walking in a storm, but his eyes had the look Walter recognized from the machine shop floor, the look of a man carrying something heavy that had nothing to do with weather. And somewhere in the back of Walter's mind, he heard Carol's voice, clear as the day she first said it. You never turn away someone standing in the rain. Walter stepped back and opened the door wider. He said, "Come in, I've got soup on." What happened over the next 11 hours seemed, at the time, like nothing at all. Walter gave Dan a towel and one of his old flannel shirts. They ate tomato soup and saltine crackers at the kitchen table while the storm threw itself against the windows. And they talked. Not small talk either. There's a strange honesty that happens between two strangers at night. An honesty that's easier precisely because you'll never see each other again. Dan asked Walter about his work, and Walter told him about 41 years at Brennan, about the machines he could still hear in his sleep. Dan asked about the woman in the photographs on the wall, and Walter told him about Carol, the lemonade, the porch light, the hospice room. He even told him about Tricia, about the parking lot, about the phone that never rang. Dan mostly listened. He said very little about himself, only that he'd worked in business, that it hadn't gone the way he'd hoped, and that he was trying to settle some accounts before the end of the year. Walter didn't press. Men of his generation didn't. But near midnight, as Walter was pulling a blanket and pillow from the hall closet for the couch, Dan asked him one question that stopped him mid-step. He asked, "If you had money, Walter, real money, more than you could spend, what would you fix first?" Walter thought about it for a moment, standing there with the pillow in his hands. He didn't say the roof, which leaked. He didn't say the medical debt that had swallowed his retirement. He said, "I'd fix things with my daughter. Everything else is just stuff." Dan didn't answer. He just nodded, slowly, and looked away. When Walter came downstairs at 6:30 the next morning, the couch was empty. The blanket was folded into a perfect square with the pillow set on top, military neat. The borrowed flannel shirt was folded beside it, and on the coffee table, weighted down by the salt shaker from the kitchen, was a note written on the back of an envelope in careful, deliberate handwriting. 5 words, "You were the last one. Thank you." Walter stood in his living room in the gray morning light, reading it twice, 3 times. The last one. The last one for what? He walked to the front window and looked out at Kettering Avenue, washed clean by the storm, empty in both directions. No car, no footprints. It was as if the man had never existed. Walter put the note in the kitchen drawer, next to Carol's old grocery lists, and went on with his life. And for 4 weeks, nothing happened. That's the part of this story people struggle to believe, that a man could sit at the center of something this enormous and have no idea. Walter fed the orange cat on Tuesdays. He went to coffee hour. Thanksgiving came, and he ate a turkey sandwich alone at the kitchen table and thought about calling Columbus, and didn't. Once or twice he thought about the stranger, wondered if he'd found wherever he was going. Meanwhile, 200 miles away, in a private hospital suite in Cleveland, machines were being switched off. Lawyers were being summoned. A document signed 9 days after the storm was being pulled from a fireproof safe. And a name was being read aloud in a conference room full of stunned, furious people. Walter Hayes, of Kettering Avenue, Dayton, Ohio. A man none of them had ever heard of. Which brings us back to where this story began. December 2nd. The coffee mug in the sink. 3 sharp knocks. The woman on the porch introduced herself as Rebecca Lynn, attorney with a firm in Cleveland, and she asked Walter the question about the couch and the night of November 3rd. Walter told her the truth, that a man had stayed one night during the storm, but that his name was Dan, just Dan, and he'd never given more than that. Rebecca Lynn opened her briefcase on Walter's kitchen table, the same table where Walter and the stranger had eaten tomato soup, and she laid down a photograph. Walter looked at it and felt the floor tilt. It was him, the man from the couch. Except in this photograph he was in a tailored suit, standing at a podium, and the caption underneath read, "Daniel Mercer, founder and chairman, Mercer Industrial Group." Rebecca Lynn spoke carefully, the way people do when they know each sentence is a hammer. Daniel Mercer had died 11 days earlier of pancreatic cancer, at 63 years old. He was worth approximately $340 million. He had no wife, no children, and 1 surviving brother. And 9 days after the night of the storm, he had summoned her to his home and amended his last will and testament. Walter asked what any of this had to do with him. Rebecca Lynn took a breath, and then she told him. "Mr. Hayes," she said, "Daniel Mercer left you $4.2 million. And there is a letter, addressed to you in his own handwriting, that the court will not release until probate is settled." Walter sat down. He had to. His legs simply stopped agreeing to hold him. He remembers laughing, actually laughing, because it had to be a mistake, or a scam, one of those things you hear about on the news where they take everything from old men who believe too easily. He told her she had the wrong house. She showed him the will. He told her the man on his couch was practically homeless. She showed him more photographs. Daniel Mercer shaking hands with governors. Daniel Mercer on the cover of a trade magazine. Daniel Mercer standing in front of a factory gate that made Walter's chest go tight, because he recognized that gate. He'd driven past it for years. And then, as the shock was still settling over him like dust after a demolition, Rebecca Lynn said the words that turned a miracle into a nightmare. "Mr. Hayes, there's a complication. His brother is contesting the will, and he's naming you, Gordon Mercer. Remember that name, because for the next several months of Walter's life, that name would be everywhere." Gordon was Daniel's older brother by 3 years, a man who had spent his life adjacent to his brother's fortune, holding a seat on the board, drawing a salary, and waiting. Under the original will, Gordon stood to inherit nearly everything. Under the amended one, he received a single dollar and a sealed letter of his own. Within 72 hours of the will being read, Gordon had retained one of the most aggressive probate litigation firms in the Midwest, and their claim was simple and brutal. Daniel Mercer was dying, medicated and not in his right mind. And the retired machinist from Dayton wasn't a good Samaritan at all. He was a predator who had targeted a vulnerable rich man, and that night of kindness was a performance. Walter's quiet life ended within the week. A reporter from a Cleveland station knocked first, then two more. Then a van parked across the street with a camera pointed at his front door, at Carol's porch light. The story wrote itself, and everyone wrote a different version. "Local hero rewarded for kindness," said one headline. "Questions surround mystery heir in Mercer fortune fight," said another. At First Methodist, the coffee hour went strange. Conversation stopped when Walter walked in. A man he'd known 30 years asked him, half joking and half not, what he'd really done to get a millionaire to sign over $4 million. The anonymous calls started after that. Walter stopped answering the phone. He sat alone in his house at night, the note from the kitchen drawer in his hands, reading those 5 words over and over. "You were the last one." And then came the photograph. Gordon's legal team filed it as evidence, and Rebecca Lynn drove down from Cleveland to show Walter before the press got hold of it. It was a still image from a doorbell camera belonging to a house at the far end of Kettering Avenue, time-stamped October 31st, 3 days before the storm. It showed a dark sedan parked at the curb, and behind the wheel, unmistakable, even in the grainy frame, sat Daniel Mercer, watching the street. Watching, as far as anyone could tell, Walter's house. Gordon's lawyers said it proved the meeting was planned, and if it was planned, then somebody did the planning, and Walter's whole story of a random stranger in the rain collapsed. Walter stared at that image and felt something cold move through him, because he couldn't explain it. Why was the man watching his house 3 days before he ever knocked? The deposition took place in a glass conference room in downtown Cleveland, and it lasted 6 hours. Walter sat across from 3 attorneys who billed more per hour than he used to earn in a week, and they took his life apart piece by piece. They asked how a man with $940 in savings felt about money. They asked whether he'd researched Daniel Mercer online, whether he owned a computer, whether his financial desperation had ever made him consider, in their words, creative solutions. They asked about Carol's medical debt, reading the numbers aloud like an accusation. They asked why a stranger would trust him so quickly unless he'd been made to feel safe by design. And then they slid the doorbell photograph across the table and asked the question everything hinged on. "Mr. Hayes, if you'd never met Daniel Mercer, why was he watching your house?" Walter said the only thing he could say, which was the truth. "I don't know." He said it 11 times that day, and every time, the youngest of the 3 lawyers wrote something on his legal pad, and every time, Walter felt the truth sound more like a lie. On the drive home, Rebecca Lynn tried to reassure him, but Walter barely heard her. The legal fees were consuming what little he had. His name was in newspapers being read by people who'd known him his whole life. And somewhere in Columbus, he knew Tricia was seeing all of it. Every headline, every insinuation, and drawing her own conclusions about the father she already didn't speak to. That night, Walter called Rebecca Lynn and told her he was done. He didn't want the money. He'd never asked for it. He wanted to sign whatever paper made it all stop. What Rebecca Lynn said next may be the single most important sentence in this entire story. She let him finish, and then she said, "Mr. Hayes, if you walk away now, the record will say you were a con man who got caught. That will be the last public word on your name, forever. Is that what Carol would have wanted your name to be?" The line went quiet for a long time. Walter stood in his kitchen, looking at the porch light glowing through the front window, at the empty chair where a soaked stranger had once eaten soup, and something in him settled into place, the same stubbornness that kept a man on a machine shop floor for 41 years. He told her, "All right, we fight." He didn't know it yet, but 11 days later, Rebecca Lynn would find the thing that changed everything. It surfaced during discovery, buried in an inventory of Daniel Mercer's personal effects, listed as item 47, one leather-bound notebook. Gordon's legal team had flagged it as private medical material and moved to keep it sealed, and they fought hard, harder than they fought over documents worth millions, and that fight was itself the tell. Rebecca Lynn noticed. She pushed back, filed motions, argued that a document in the deceased's own hand, written in the very weeks the will was amended, went to the heart of his state of mind. The judge agreed, and when the seal came off item 47, and Rebecca Lynn read it for the first time in a records room in Cleveland, she had to stop, set it down, and walk out to her car to be alone. Because Daniel Mercer's journal didn't just explain the night of the storm. It explained everything. To read that journal is to meet the real Daniel Mercer, and the real Daniel Mercer was a man doing arithmetic on his own soul. The first entry is dated April 9th, the day of his diagnosis. Pancreatic cancer, inoperable. 6 months, perhaps 8. He wrote that he sat in his car in the hospital parking garage for 2 hours, and that in those 2 hours he tried to think of one person, one single person, who would grieve him rather than his estate, and he could not. He wrote, "I have built machines, factories, and a fortune, and I have not built one human being who will miss me." The entries that follow are a man auditing his life the way an accountant audits a failing company. And again, one word keeps appearing in those pages: closures, the factories he shut down. Mercer Industrial had grown the way empires grow, by consuming. Through the 90s and 2000s, Daniel bought struggling plants across Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan, kept the profitable ones, and closed the rest. Towns gutted. Thousands of jobs erased by his signature. In the journal, he lists them by name like a confession, and one entry stops the heart. Brennan Machine and Tool, Dayton. Daniel had acquired a controlling stake in Brennan's parent company in 1998 and ordered cuts that nearly closed the plant. The same plant where Walter Hayes was working, the same year Walter and Carol were fighting to keep their house. The layoffs missed Walter by 4 names on a seniority list. He never knew whose signature had hovered over his life that year. But Daniel Mercer knew, and 26 years later, dying, he made a list of the towns he had hollowed out. Then comes the entry dated August 2nd, the one Rebecca Lynn would later read aloud in open court. Daniel wrote, "I have decided on the experiment. I will go to the places I damaged, to the streets of the men and women whose livelihoods I traded for margin, and I will knock on their doors as a nobody, with nothing to offer and nothing to my name. I want to know what I believed my whole career, that people are transactions, that no one gives without calculating. If I am right, I will die comfortable in my judgment. If I am wrong, then I will owe a debt no board of directors can settle." He bought second-hand clothes at a thrift store in Akron. He left his phone, his cards, his watch. And in September of 2024, one of the richest men in Ohio began knocking on strangers' doors in the rain. The journal records every door, 63 of them, across 11 towns over 9 weeks. He knocked in Youngstown, where a man threatened to call the police. He knocked in Mansfield, where a door opened 4 inches and shut. In Lima, a woman let him stand in her garage for an hour, then asked him to leave before her husband got home. In Springfield, a younger couple let him in, fed him, and then, when he offered to repay their kindness someday, handed him a piece of paper with their bank details already written out, as if they'd been waiting. He wrote that one hurt the most, because they'd almost proven him wrong. 62 doors, and his verdict was holding. People were transactions. Kindness had a price tag or a lock on it. And then, on the 3rd of November, he came to Dayton, to Kettering Avenue. And here the journal answers the question that nearly destroyed Walter Hayes in that deposition room. The doorbell photograph. The sedan on October 31st. Daniel wrote that Dayton was different, that Dayton frightened him, because Brennan was personal, and he had pulled the seniority lists from 1998, the actual lists, and found the names of the men who had survived his cuts by inches. He chose Walter's Street deliberately, and then he sat in his car at the end of Kettering Avenue for 3 separate evenings, watching, unable to make himself walk up to the door. He wrote, "I have stared down boardrooms and bankruptcy judges, and I cannot knock on the door of a machinist." On the 3rd night, a storm rolled in off the plains, and Daniel Mercer wrote one line before leaving his car: "If the light is on, I will knock." The entry describing the night itself runs 4 pages, and Rebecca Lynn has said she has never read anything like it in 20 years of probate law. Daniel wrote about the soup, the flannel shirt, the photographs of Carol on the wall. He wrote he gave me his dead wife's rule and his own bed linens, and he asked me for nothing, not once, not even my last name. He wrote about the question he asked at midnight, the test inside the test: what would you fix first? and how every other door that got that far had answered with a number, a roof, a truck, a debt. And Walter Hayes had said, "My daughter. Everything else is just stuff." Daniel wrote 63 doors, and one man in Dayton, Ohio, standing in the wreckage I helped make of his industry, passed a test he never knew he was taking. He was the last one. I'm done knocking. 9 days later, Daniel Mercer sat across from Rebecca Lynn, lucid, precise, and by her sworn account sharper than most healthy clients she had ever advised, and he amended his will. $4.2 million to Walter Hayes. And in the journal, he explained the number, and the explanation is the kind of detail no one could invent. It was not a round gift. It was a calculation. Daniel had gone back through Brennan's books from 1998 and worked out, wage by wage, year by year, what his cuts had cost the floor workers of that plant in overtime, in raises frozen, in pensions trimmed, compounded over 26 years. He wrote, "This is not generosity. Generosity is what he showed me. This is an invoice, and I am finally paying it." But the journal contained one more secret on its final pages. And it wasn't about Walter at all. It was about Tricia. The trial opened on a cold Tuesday in March, in a probate courtroom in Cleveland that was never built for camera crews, and by 9 that morning the hallway outside was full of them. Gordon Mercer arrived first, flanked by 4 attorneys, and gave a statement on the courthouse steps about protecting his brother's true wishes from those who prey on the dying. Walter arrived 20 minutes later in his one gray suit, the suit he had bought for Carol's funeral, and said nothing at all. Inside, Gordon's team came out swinging, and their strategy was exactly what Rebecca Lynn had predicted. Keep the journal out. If the journal never reached the judge, then all that remained was a dying man, a fortune, a stranger, and a photograph of a car watching a house. Without those pages, Walter's truth had no witness. Daniel Mercer was the only man who could testify for Walter, and Daniel Mercer was dead. For 2 full days, the lawyers fought over item 47. Gordon's team argued the journal was the product of a deteriorating mind, medicated ramblings with no legal weight, private medical material that would humiliate the deceased. They brought in a paid expert who testified about pain medication and cognitive decline, speaking in percentages and probabilities about a man he had never met. And then Rebecca Lynn stood up and did something quietly devastating. She entered Daniel's pharmacy records into evidence and walked the court through them, date by date. Daniel Mercer had refused opioid pain management until the final 9 days of his life. Every journal entry, every door he knocked on, every page about the night in Dayton was written by a man in agony and stone-cold sober. Because, as he wrote in the journal itself, "I want to be certain that what I find at these doors is real, and so is my judgment of it." The judge admitted the journal in full, and over the following days the courtroom heard it read aloud. The parking garage, the 63 doors, the couple in Springfield with the bank details, the 3 nights in the sedan at the end of Kettering Avenue, the porch light, the soup, the 5 words on the back of an envelope. Reporters who had covered this story as a fraud case sat in the gallery and went silent. Somewhere in the middle of the reading, a juror's assistant was seen wiping her eyes, and Walter Hayes, sitting at the plaintiff's table in his funeral suit, heard for the first time in his life what that night had looked like from the other chair at his own kitchen table. He heard a dead man describe him. He gave me his dead wife's rule, and he asked me for nothing. Walter kept his eyes down and his hands folded, and he did not move. Then Rebecca Lynn took the stand herself, and this was the moment Gordon's case began to crack. She testified that she had personally drafted the amendment, that Daniel had summoned her 9 days after the storm, and that the meeting lasted 3 hours. She described a client who corrected her punctuation, who recalculated a tax provision in his head faster than her associate could do it on a laptop, who asked her to read the amendment back twice and changed a single word. She said, under oath, "In 19 years of practice, I have never had a client more certain of what he was doing or why." Gordon's lead attorney tried to shake her on cross-examination for over an hour and gained nothing. But the worst moment for Gordon was still coming, because Rebecca Lynn had one more set of documents to enter, and these had nothing to do with Walter Hayes at all. They were emails. In the final year of his life, knowing what was coming, Daniel Mercer had reached out to his only brother twice. The first message, sent in May, 3 pages long, written the week after his diagnosis, told Gordon everything: the cancer, the timeline, and then a plea that is hard to hear even secondhand. Daniel asked his brother to come to Cleveland, to spend one weekend with him, to talk about their parents, about the fishing trips at Mosquito Lake when they were boys. Before there was a company between them. He wrote, "I am not asking you as chairman. I am asking you as your brother. I do not have many chances left to ask anyone anything." The reply came 6 days later, 2 lines, sent not by Gordon but by Gordon's executive assistant. "Mr. Mercer thanks you for the update and asks that all further correspondence go through counsel." The second attempt came in September, in the middle of the 63 doors, a shorter message this time, almost stripped of hope. Daniel wrote, "I am doing something these last months that I cannot explain in an email. When it is finished, I would like to tell you about it in person. One dinner, Gordon. That is all I am asking for." The reply took 11 days, and again it came from the assistant. "Mr. Mercer's calendar does not permit additional engagements this quarter." When Rebecca Lynn read those 2 replies aloud, slowly, one after the other, the courtroom went so quiet you could hear the radiator ticking. Every person in that room understood the same thing at the same moment. Gordon Mercer was suing a stranger for showing his brother the one thing he himself had refused to give him, a door that opened. Gordon stared straight ahead and did not blink. And it was then, with Gordon's case bleeding on the floor, that the judge disclosed something that no one in the gallery, and almost no one at either table, saw coming. Among Daniel Mercer's testamentary documents held by the court, there was a second sealed envelope. It was not addressed to Gordon Mercer. It was not addressed to Walter Hayes. It was addressed, in Daniel's own handwriting, to a woman named Tricia Hayes of Columbus, Ohio. Walter's head came up for the first time in days. His daughter, who he had not spoken to in 3 years, whose name he had said exactly once to a soaked stranger over tomato soup at midnight. Daniel Mercer had never met Tricia Hayes. He had heard her name for 11 hours of his life, and he had written her a letter and sealed it into his will. The judge ordered her located and summoned. She came on a Thursday, and Walter learned she was coming the way everyone else did, from the docket. He did not sleep the night before. Tricia Hayes was 38 now, sharp-shouldered, working in hospital administration in Columbus, and she walked into that courtroom without looking at the plaintiff's table, sat where she was told, and answered the preliminary questions in a flat, careful voice. She confirmed she was Walter's daughter. She confirmed they were estranged. Asked when she had last spoken to her father, she said, "My mother's funeral," and the words landed on Walter like a physical weight. Then the clerk brought out the envelope, and the court learned what Daniel Mercer had done in his final days. And even Rebecca Lynn, who thought she knew every corner of this estate, sat back in her chair. Because Daniel hadn't just written Tricia a letter, he had built her a door. The letter was read into the record. Daniel wrote, "You do not know me, and your father does not know I am writing this. I spent one night in his house, and in that night he told me about you, and I want you to know what he said. He said the money did not matter. He said everything else was just stuff. I asked a dying man's question, and your father gave a living man's answer, and the answer was you. Then came the provision, $500,000, held in trust in Tricia's name, with one condition, that she visit her father once. Not reconcile, not forgive, visit one time, of her own choosing." Daniel wrote, "I am not buying a family back together. I know better than anyone alive that this cannot be bought. I am only paying for the door to be unlocked. Walking through it is yours." The courtroom turned every head to the woman in the witness area, and Tricia Hayes sat perfectly still with her jaw set exactly the way Carol's used to, and said nothing. The judge asked if she wished to make any statement regarding the trust. She said, "Not at this time, Your Honor." And then she stood, gathered her coat, and walked down the center aisle of that courtroom, past the reporters, past Gordon's lawyers, and past her father, 3 feet from his shoulder, close enough that Walter could smell the same shampoo Carol used to buy, and she did not stop, and she did not look at him, and the doors swung shut behind her. Walter Hayes had faced accusations, cameras, and 6 hours of deposition without breaking. Watching his daughter walk past him was the only moment of the entire trial where anyone saw his hands shake. By that Friday, everyone in the courthouse could read the scoreboard. The journal was in. Rebecca Lynn's testimony stood unshaken. The emails had turned the gallery, the press, and very possibly the judge. Gordon's attorneys requested a recess to the following week, and the legal reporters covering the case wrote that a settlement offer was surely coming, that Gordon would fold quietly to stop the bleeding. They were wrong, because on Monday morning, Gordon Mercer's lead attorney stood up and announced that new evidence had come to light over the weekend, and that they were calling a final witness, a witness who was not on any list, whose existence they claimed to have only just discovered. A waitress from a diner off Interstate 75, north of Dayton. And what she was prepared to swear under oath was this, that Walter Hayes and Daniel Mercer had met before, a full week before the storm. Her name was Donna Kessler, and she had worked the counter at a truck stop diner on Interstate 75 for 19 years. She took the stand on Monday morning in her Sunday clothes, visibly nervous, and testified that on the afternoon of October 27th, a full week before the storm, two men had sat in her corner booth for over an hour, talking low over coffee. She identified the first man from a photograph as Daniel Mercer. She identified the second man, pointing across the courtroom with a steady enough finger, as Walter Hayes. She said they had papers on the table between them. She said they shook hands when they left. And just like that, the entire case flipped. Because if Walter had met Daniel a week before the storm, then the knock on the door was theater, the soup was theater, and every word Walter Hayes had ever said about that night was a lie. The gallery erupted into murmurs. The reporters started typing, and at the plaintiff's table Walter turned to Rebecca Lynn and said 4 words, quietly, evenly, the way he said everything. I've never seen her. Rebecca Lynn looked at her client for a long moment, and then she asked the judge for the afternoon, before beginning cross-examination, and the judge granted it. What happened in those few hours is the reason this story ends the way it does. Because Rebecca Lynn did not spend the recess preparing questions about the diner, or the coffee, or the corner booth. She had noticed something else, something small, the kind of detail that wins and loses everything. Donna Kessler had described the papers on the table, and when asked, offhand what kind of papers, she had said, legal looking, in one of those blue folders, blue-backed legal folders. Rebecca Lynn knew exactly one firm that still used them. Cross-examination began at 3 o'clock, and it was over in 40 minutes. Rebecca Lynn asked Donna Kessler about October 27th, and Donna repeated her story smoothly. Then Rebecca Lynn asked about October 26th, the day before, and Donna's answers got slower. Then she produced the diner's own shift records, subpoenaed during the recess, which showed that Donna Kessler had not worked at all during the week in question. She had been in Tennessee at her sister's. There were gas station receipts. Donna's face went gray. And then came the final question. Mrs. Kessler, in the last 30 days, have you received any payment, gift, or promise of money from any person connected to this case? Donna Kessler looked at Gordon Mercer's table, looked down at her hands, and asked for a lawyer. The judge cleared the courtroom. By evening, investigators had traced a $9,000 wire to her account, sent through a shell company whose registered agent was Gordon Mercer's executive assistant, the same assistant who had answered a dying man's plea for one dinner with 2 cold lines about calendars. Gordon's legal team withdrew the witness the next morning and moved to distance themselves from what they called an independent act by an employee, but it no longer mattered. The contest was dead, and everyone knew it. 3 days later, the judge ruled from the bench. The amended will of Daniel Mercer was valid in every provision, executed by a man of sound mind and settled purpose. The estate would be distributed exactly as Daniel had written it, $4.2 million to Walter Hayes, $500,000 in trust for Tricia Hayes, $1 to Gordon Mercer, along with a criminal referral to the county prosecutor regarding the matter of Donna Kessler, a referral that would keep Gordon's lawyers employed for another 2 years. The reporters ran for the hallway. It was over. Except for one thing, the letter. The one addressed to Walter, sealed until probate closed. The one Rebecca Lynn had mentioned on his porch back in December on the morning this all began. She brought it to Dayton herself, hand-delivered it at the same kitchen table, and offered to stay while he read it. Walter asked to be alone. What that letter said, Walter has never fully shared, and out of respect, no one has pushed. But he did tell Rebecca Lynn one part of it, the ending, and she later repeated it, with his blessing, because she believed people needed to hear it. Daniel Mercer closed his letter with this. You asked me nothing all night, so you never learned my name, and I have wondered since whether you would have opened the door if you had known it. Known what I did to Brennan, to your town. I think you would have. That is the terrible, wonderful thing about you, Walter. You would have. Now, here is the part of this story that the news cameras missed, because news cameras leave when verdicts are read. The money arrived in the spring, and the people of Dayton waited to see what it would do to Walter Hayes, because everyone knows what sudden money does to people. Here is what it did. Nothing they could see. He kept the house on Kettering Avenue. He kept the couch. He drove the same car until it genuinely quit. But that autumn, First Methodist got a new roof, paid for anonymously, though everyone knew, because the roofer's crew said the check came from a man who insisted on bringing them coffee every morning at 7. And at the old Brennan plant, still limping along under new owners, a hardship fund quietly appeared, available to any floor worker facing medical bills. No questions, no ledger. The paperwork named it the Carroll Fund. It exists to this day, and the porch light stayed on. Every evening, without fail, the same as it had for 40 years. And if you had driven down Kettering Avenue on an ordinary rainy Tuesday the following November, almost a year to the day after the storm, you would have seen it glowing, and you would have seen a car you didn't recognize pull to the curb, and a woman in her late 30s sit behind the wheel for 11 minutes without moving. Walter saw her from the window. He didn't go out. He had learned something from a dead man about doors, that you can pay to unlock one, but walking through it belongs to the person on the other side. So he put the kettle on, set out 2 mugs, and waited. And then it came, the sound he had stopped believing in. A knock, slow, almost apologetic. Walter Hayes crossed his living room and opened the door. Tricia stood on the porch. Under the light her mother never let go dark, rain on her shoulders, and the first words out of her were not hello and not I'm sorry. She said, I want you to know I'm not here for the trust. I read what he wrote. I came on my own. And Walter, who had faced down millionaires and lawyers and cameras with a machinist's calm, could not get a single word out, so he did the only thing he knew how to do, the thing he had done all his life. He stepped back and opened the door wider. She came in. The visit was awkward and quiet and too short, and it did not fix 3 years in one evening, because nothing real works that way. But when she left, she said, I'll call you Sunday, and she did. She has called every Sunday since. Gordon Mercer settled the witness tampering matter without admitting guilt, paid a fine that made headlines for a day, and resigned from the board of the company his brother built. He lives alone outside Cleveland. Those who know him say he has never once spoken his brother's name. Donna Kessler avoided prison by cooperating and moved to Tennessee for good. Rebecca Lynn still practices in Cleveland, but she keeps one framed item on her office wall that has nothing to do with any diploma. It is a photocopy of 5 words written on the back of an envelope. And in a drawer in a kitchen in Dayton, next to grocery lists in a dead woman's handwriting, the original sits where it has always been. 63 doors. 62 of them proved a rich man right about the world. One of them, one porch light on a flooded street in Ohio, proved him wrong. So the question this story leaves behind is not really about Walter Hayes, and it never was. Daniel Mercer spent $340 million and the last weeks of his life trying to answer one question, whether anyone would give without calculating, and he had to knock on 63 doors to find a single yes. That is the number worth sitting with tonight. Not the 4.2 million, the 63. Because somewhere out there, on some ordinary street, somebody is standing in the rain right now, and the only thing anyone will ever remember about us is which kind of door we were. So we want to hear from you. Would you have opened the door that night? Has a stranger ever changed your life? Or have you ever been the stranger? Tell us in the comments. We read every one. And if this story stayed with you, the next one goes further. Make sure you're subscribed with notifications on so you don't miss it.